Everyone lost the desire to train. In the evening we would return to the village to dry out, and after dinner, half dead, we would lie down to sleep a bit. One evening someone threw a clump of manure from a hardened manure pile at the curtained window of the officer's hut, from behind which you could hear the loud sounds of a gramophone and the officers' merrymaking. The sound of shattering glass rang out. The gramophone fell silent. Whatever was going on inside the hut, nobody knew. By the next morning, the window had been repaired through Osip Osipovich's efforts, and now a soldier with a carbine was standing next to the hut, the guardian of the commander's amusements. At night, in the tents, the soldiers pondered how they should carry on. The same conversation was going on in our tent as in all the others, quite likely, and with each passing night the conversation became sharper. How can the commissar tolerate such shameful behaviour? But he's with them, dancing, guzzling samagon. The Red Army is the workers' and peasants' army. We're all officers and soldiers alike, from the same people. We may be from the same people, but those who hold power have made saloons for themselves. If Vasily Ivanitch had known about such debauchery back in the Urals, he would have drowned the fools. Everyone chuckled, but then the conversation became sharper. If only someone would let the division commander know, he'd bring them to their senses. The swine! Tomorrow we'll be going into battle together, and they're sleeping around, and don't even consider us to be human. What then, fellows, shall we roll out a gun and, like the Aurora back in 1917, take a few pot shots at the counter-revolutionaries? They are real counter-revolutionaries. What are you, crazy? Do you want to lead us all before the firing squad? Soon another event occurred. From a laundry line, which stretched between two stakes pounded into the ground near the commander's hut, someone pulled down our platoon commander's clean shirt and left it lying in the mud. The sentry was punished, which made us all indignant. On that same day, a new commander was appointed over us. Our commander had become ill. Around evening, some of the old men in the battery called me out from my tent to have a serious chat. You're an educated fellow, and you know the Komsomol command of the regiment. It is impossible to take this any longer. Go have a heart-to-heart talk with the commissar. Perhaps he'll change his mind. Go have a talk, like one party member with another. You communists have special relationships, not like the ones we have. First of all, I answered, what do I have to do with the Komsomol command? Secondly, I'm not a communist. For us in the battery, you'll become a communist if you muster up the courage and tell the commissar the truth. The old men fell silent, waiting for my answer. For the first time in my life, serious men, much older than me, frontline veterans who had more than once looked death in the eye, were believing in me, relying upon my courage and capability to do a citizen's act in the name of justice. Forgetting the wise saying, "Look before you leap," I agreed with their request. I walked up to the commander's hut and asked the sentry to summon the commissar. The commissar quickly emerged, and he glanced at me with surprise. When I told him that I wanted to speak with him about a serious political matter, he, as always, politely smiled. "Come on, you're talking nonsense, little soldier. What sort of serious political business can you have?" I wasn't expecting from him an immediate agreement to a discussion. But the commissar suddenly offered to have a little chat in the forest. We took a seat on a fallen tree trunk. The commissar looked, as always, rather dandyish. A young brunette with a well-groomed full face, he was one of those men everybody knew, who constantly fussed over his appearance like a woman. I liked him somewhat. Now, plainly, he was ready for an evening party. He was clean-shaven, and his hair glistened with some sort of hair cream, which gave his hair a silvery sheen. The buttons on his shirt, the star on his forage cap, and his boots were all gleaming. He was giving off the scent of some eau de cologne, which at that time was beyond a front-line soldier's wildest dreams. How could I measure up against him? I was wearing a faded field shirt and boots that had not been cleaned for a long time, and I had dirty fingernails. Nevertheless, the conversation took place. I sincerely, frankly, laid out everything as it was. Without resorting to crude words, I began to tell him about the facts and about the mood in the battery. While he listened, he fanned himself with a little branch and didn't ask any questions. I finished my report. Silence reigned. Finally, the commissar spoke up, and the conversation didn't go at all in the way I expected. More accurately, no conversation ensued at all. It was a monologue. The commissar spoke rudely, didactically, and scornfully. "What a hero you are! I didn't imagine. It will be interesting to see how you will be in combat. It turns out, cadet, that you are also a troublemaker. I hope they didn't teach you this in the specialist school. Remember what I am about to tell you. You are still young and hot-blooded. The calves back in your battery put you up to this, to butt in, while they hide in the bushes. Your entire speech was complete nonsense. What are you getting at? A little more stew meat in your soup? It was all spoiled. Go see the sergeant major. He'll show you the corresponding document. The quantity of oats for the commissaries has been reduced throughout the army. Nature doesn't listen to us. Do you think that what is going on these days should be easier for the soldiers? Everything else you said was rubbish. You, soldier, haven't offended just the commissar, but the party itself. Therefore you deserve punishment. But I'm not a vengeful person. I treat everyone with respect. Everybody knows this. Moreover, as you said yourself, we will be going into battle together. Thus think seriously about what I have just told you." Depressed and stunned, I didn't say a single word. He stood up. Without saluting, we went our separate ways. Doubts overwhelmed me. Perhaps I hadn't found the right words and had failed to engage him in an open, heart-to-heart discussion. No, and again no. I was not guilty of anything. It is simply that he was one of those demagogues who cover their vices with high-sounding words, a hypocrite and a blowhard. But there remained a bitter falling out from my talk with the commissar. The next day, Chapai ordered me to transfer to a platoon in a nearby village. I understood that they were moving me a little farther away from the command's gaze. Clearly, this was at the suggestion of the commissar. Well, if that's what they wanted, I was fine with it. Gathering up my carbine, my knapsack, and my greatcoat, and saying farewell to the rest of my gun crew, I set off for my new place of service. Before I left, the guys told me that the commissar, in the presence of several people, including the Sergeant Major Osip Osipovich, had uttered, "Complaining in the army isn't authorized," from the Manual of a Soldier's Rules of Conduct. I walked along a narrow forest path, rejoicing over the encounter with the wonders of a green summer forest, a clear sky, the grandest trees, and the clean, fresh air. It was sad to leave my comrades, but at the same time I was feeling happy. Nature literally took me into her comforting embrace, dissolving and dissipating my worries, healing and making me stronger. Suddenly, everything became so easy. To hell with the commissar, to hell with all his contrary words. And what difference did it make in which platoon I served? By the way, they say my new platoon has an excellent commander. Suddenly someone hailed me and I turned around. Behind me, Sabit Kalikov was riding up on horseback. Drawing even with me, he stopped his horse. "Why aren't you coming to the Komsomol committee meeting? I called your Chapai twice, and he promised to send you." I made no effort to explain the situation, nor did I talk about what had occurred. I tried to offer an excuse. I didn't know about it, nobody informed me. Together we reached the new platoon's encampment. Along the road, Sabit enthusiastically talked about the combat preparations in the division, how it was becoming stronger, and I heard a lot of flattering words about the division commander, Kuprianov. "I've never met a man like him before," Sabit announced. "He's the best commander one could have." Once I reported. To the new commander I was assigned to a guard post on the perimeter of the camp. As I went out on guard duty, I was greeted by a serious, decisive, quiet and reliable officer. He was a different breed. I immediately felt at ease and glad that I was assigned to this platoon. That evening I began to feel the first calm in a long time. Soon the order was given to get ready for combat, and we all felt that something very serious was coming. We had heard the sound of artillery and rifle shots from the front and reports of the army making advances. The soldiers' discontent had provoked the company sergeant major, and on my very first day I became witness to the squabbles between him and Shirker. "Why are we still not receiving any mail?" Shirker asked indignantly. The sergeant major, shrugging his shoulders, answered indifferently, "The mail isn't part of a sergeant major's duties. Our job is to pass along an order on time and to make sure a soldier gets his grub and combat supplies. Meanwhile, your business, sergeant, is to fight the Germans." Shirker got wound up. "What, comrade sergeant major, don't you plan to fight together with us in battle?" After a moment's silence, the sergeant major answered, "I'll do whatever I'm ordered to do." During the years of the war, I accumulated a whole collection of the most diverse types of sergeant majors. This one was my fourth already. This one was a dull personality. Such was the opinion of the soldiers, and I shared it. I hadn't yet managed to find my place in the rifle company, to get used to my new squad, and to comprehend my simple duties, when suddenly the regiment raised the alarm. Within a couple of hours, the entire division was moving at a quick step toward the nearest railway station. We marched all night, not knowing why or where we were being led. What if the Hitlerite beast had pounced again upon Moscow? Someone recalled the words of the commissar, "A mortal danger is hanging over the country. The Germans are rushing for the Volga." The soldiers' telegraph of the most diverse rumours was coming, as often happened, to the same point. Our division was being urgently sent to Stalingrad. During the night, we marched about 30 kilometres. The next morning, I saw the division commander for the first time. He was standing on the shoulder of the road next to some Soviet-built M11 staff cars, overseeing the passing troops with a calm, attentive gaze. He was tall, well-built, and exuded self-confidence. He had a simple peasant's face and lively eyes, which were intensely focused on the passing formation. Probably one thought was troubling him. Would we stand firm? Could we cope with the situation at Stalingrad? For he clearly understood, which he had to keep secret, that there was still much to be done with our division, that we were still not ready, that some soldiers still did not know how to fight. He could not fail to sense the personal responsibility he had for each soldier entrusted to him. Perhaps he was distressed. "Oh, if only for another month or two, then I'd have confidence in the combat strength and spirit of the division." Then, suddenly, once again, without any explanation, the column stopped. We were directed into a forest for a short halt that slightly revived us after our difficult night march, and then once again we were moving out. But now we had changed direction and were following the rear elements and vehicles, which were disappearing down the road ahead of us. The soldiers' telegraph immediately tapped out a new message. Stalin had found out about us and ordered, "Don't take one soldier away from Rzhev." So I didn't wind up at Stalingrad. It is now known that in 1942, 50 divisions were withdrawn from all the fronts and sent to Stalingrad, including a few divisions from the Western Front. But for some reason they left our division alone, and we remained in reserve. I must say that at the front the regular soldier is more interested in how his division commander presents himself than the commander does himself. Such an assertion may seem incomprehensible or amusing. After all, the division commander is as distant from the division's rank and file as heaven itself. But that's the way new recruits or indifferent people consider the matter. The front-line soldier, however, who finds himself in a new division, will, as his first order of business, ask not about his platoon commander or the company commander, but about the division commander. Why? In the given case, the slightly altered storyteller's introduction is apt. "Tell me who your division commander is, and I'll tell you everything about your company or platoon commander." During the years of war, I happened to see all sorts of division commanders. Some commanded like a hussar, loudly, at times expressively, whether an order or a word, roaring and thunder. Fail to carry out their order, and a severe punishment awaits you. This is the worst type of division commander, real martinets, who have no interest in the opinion of subordinates, and who recognize only one rule: forward, hurrah. In fact, it was for this reason that they acquired the scornful nickname Uria. How much soldiers' blood rests on their conscience? Other division commanders assumed that the highest sense of the language of command lay in the selection of curses and swear words. In their conception, it was only with the help of abusive language that you could force a man to fight, for war in their understanding is life wrong side out. It is well known that obscene language flourished at all levels of command during the war and became accepted as normal speech. The higher the rank, the more loudly and expressively they swore. According to general opinion, among the marshals of the war years, only Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky didn't lower himself to such widespread vileness. The war also firmly attached to some commanders the fitting label thug, mordoboyshchik, literally snout puncher. To them, a punch on the snout not only awarded personal satisfaction, but also consolidated their personal superiority. Giving free rein to their fists, the thugs considered such action even to be a useful lesson for subordinates. And drunkards? It was difficult at that time to name an officer who never touched vodka. However, I have in mind the true drunkards, the alcoholics. The High Command excused such indiscretions as long as they didn't impinge upon combat success. During the fighting in East Prussia, I knew one division commander who could down at least a whole bottle of French cognac in one day, but could still, if necessary, drive his battalions forward with a lash. In my experience, the officers who commanded by the swear word, bottle, or fist were those lieutenants and majors who had risen in the ranks during Stalin's peacetime purges of the military. Literally within an hour's time, they became lieutenant colonels, full colonels, and generals, and now commanded regiments, brigades, and divisions. But by 1942 they were all experienced, and they carried on their shoulders the victory over the Japanese, the Finnish campaign, the operation in Poland, the tragic year of 1941, and the battle for Moscow. Now, it seemed, they had earned the right to command. This was a new Stalinist generation of practical commanders, who as a rule had little culture and no special education. Such men didn't tire themselves with mental exercise. They didn't flinch before blaming others for their own personal miscalculations. Such blame particularly fell to the lot of those officers who had graduated from military academies. As the Supreme Commander, Stalin knew his generals well. The more cruelly and impudently they behaved, the more cheerfully he twisted his moustache. He could not tolerate a disharmonious choir. He often told his assistants, "After the war we'll quickly put them back in their places, but for now let them jingle as they wish." And that is just what happened. But no matter how the Stalinist division commanders were as people, for the sake of justice it must be recognized, I didn't notice any cowardly, weak-willed, or apathetic men among them. How many of them were killed on the land of Rzhev? Many. I first heard about our division commander in June of 1942. When it became known that a division commander had arrived to take us under his command, and that he had been instructed to organize the 215th Rifle Division and lead it into battle, this news flew around all the regiments, battalions, and companies like lightning. The officers and commissars were interested in whether or not the new division commander could manage such an important assignment, and what his qualifications and combat experience were. We, the men in the ranks, thought and lived by other standards. We were interested in how this man would deal with the fate of thousands of people in soldiers' greatcoats, decently or like a brute. Soon everyone learned that the division commander was named Andrei Filiminovich Kuprianov, and that he often travelled around the regiments and didn't like to sit behind his desk. He liked to talk with people, and not just officers. Time passed, and more complete evidence about the division commander began to reach us. It became known that Kuprianov was no fortunate son. Rather, he was the son of a poor peasant. He had been serving in the Red Army since the Russian Civil War. He had honourably travelled a long military path, rising from the rank of private to that of colonel. He completed the Smolensk Combat Infantry Specialist School, and then the Frunze Military Academy. His solid service record inspired confidence. When he served as the deputy commandant of the Sverdlovsk Combat Infantry Specialist School, one of the school's officers once said, "An army without a lockup is not an army." In reply, Kuprianov suggested, But you must also give some thought to how to do things, so that the jail is empty more often. In 1941, when the Germans were approaching Moscow, he was urgently ordered to gather 1,000 cadets from his school and organize them into a rifle brigade, then come to the defense of the capital. In the late autumn and early winter of 1941, practically the entire brigade had fallen and now lay under the battlefields near Moscow. They said that Kuprianov wept openly, suffering over the death of his pupils. The army commander, Lelyushenko, an impatient and ardent man, several times demanded that Kuprianov complete the formation of the division more quickly, so as to include it in combat operations sooner. Each time Kuprianov found justifiable reasons and managed to obtain one more temporary deferment. At that time, understandably, we didn't know about this. Today I can only thank him for this, for we entered battle better prepared, which saved more than a few lives. A little more time passed, and another bit of news about the division commander reached us. We learned that he didn't shout, didn't swear, and that he addressed the regiment and battalion commanders formally, using their surnames and the formal form of address. He treated everybody the same, regardless of their rank and title, confirming through his own official actions that respect and trust for people can achieve more than yelling, cruelty, or abusive language. He ate the same food we ate and didn't recognize any commander's personal kitchens. This was a most rare occurrence at the front. I could fully appreciate this division commander only after experiencing other commanders as I passed through the war. Most division and higher commanders had an enormous entourage: personal cooks, adjutants, aides, a commandant's platoon, orderlies, clerks, a fellowship of military political workers, members of the special department, an anti-espionage office, signallers, usually female, scouts, personal transportation, commissary officers, without fail a harem or a PPZ ace, field campaign wife, the army bureaucracy. All this combined to form the strongest palisade, which separated and protected the colonel or general from the petty concerns of command. Not to mention the ordinary rank and file. Just try to break through such a barricade. Another month passed, and you could no longer find a person in the division who couldn't recognize Andrei Filimonovich by face. Always cleanly shaven and well-groomed, fully dressed out in army belts, in a new army blouse, above the left pocket of which gleamed a new Order of the Red Banner, which he had received for the fighting near Moscow. The division commander was always found in the battalions and companies, from morning until late at night, checking on what and how our officers were teaching us. He spent the most time of all among the scouts and in the separate sapper battalion. Later it became known that the reconnaissance troops of the 215th Rifle Division were considered among the best in the 30th Army. In their relations with Kuprianov, his subordinate officers appreciated his scrupulous attention to detail and his desire to avoid the slightest miscalculation. He followed the old rule, measure 7 times before cutting once. Given this, from the very first day of command, he sternly demanded strict fulfillment of his directions, which is what he called his personal orders. These directions, which were often short and to the point, most often touched upon the training and daily lives of the troops, which instilled confidence and combat spirit in the men. Upon the arrival of Kuprianov, the entire division turned into a serious combat school. The division commander knew that he didn't have much time, and he hurried to prepare everyone, privates and officers alike, as well as possible for the coming fighting. We understood this, and we tried to do everything he asked of us as well as possible. Whenever we saw a platoon commander, company commander, or often even a battalion commander next to us in the trench, behind a machine gun or on a tank, we wanted to know how to fight even better. To send you to the front untrained means we've deceived and condemned you, our officers often told us. Thus, don't complain about the work and don't be offended. You must learn and learn. In his memoirs, the commander of the Kalinin front, Is Konev, expressed his pride that the infantry units in his front were the first to go from digging individual foxholes and dugouts to constructing a continuous trench line and well-built bunkers. For this frontline experience, Marshal Konev should thank first of all Kuprianov. The division commander taught us to dig trenches and build bunkers as well as the Germans. With each passing day, the combat strength of the division grew. We received new recruits and equipment from every corner of Russia. Gone were the days when men had to rely on Molotov cocktails to destroy German tanks. Soldiers were now equipped with anti-tank rifles, PTR, which helped defend against the enemy's light tanks, though they were heavy, cumbersome, and required 2 men to carry on their shoulders. Each regiment formed a machine gun company and a company of submachine gunners, drawing primarily from the cadets. However, there were not enough submachine guns to go around, and we waited for the pending arrival of more. The division also created an artillery regiment, though it was still entirely horse-drawn. We were waiting for prime movers for the 122mm guns, which were powerful weapons in battle. Rocket-carrying trucks, the famous Katyushas, were dug deep into trenches and carefully camouflaged. The Germans called them Stalin's organs because of the howling sound of their salvo fire. Prisoners told us that the tremendous firepower of a Katyusha salvo drove some men insane. We riflemen received semi-automatic rifles with edged bayonets and light machine guns of the Degtyarev type, which we called Degtyari. Unfortunately, the first battles revealed that the Degtyarev light machine guns magazine frequently jammed and wouldn't work. Infantrymen also received new gear, such as American boots, and old greatcoats were replaced with new ones made from English fabric. The Rifle Division is an enormous living organism. Within the first 2 months, it grew to 14,000 men and women, reaching its full pre-war authorized complement. These people needed to be fed, dressed, and provided with proper sanitation. Weapons had to be kept in working order. Units such as the Transportation Battalion, the Field Bread Factory, the Armourer Shop, and the Laundry formed the division's rear. The commanders tried to place experienced men in charge of the regiments and battalions, men who had participated in the battles for Moscow. New orders and medals gleamed on the blouses of many of them. These men, their tales of fighting for Moscow and their campaign decorations inspired our admiration. Wire communications remained a weakness in the division. A tank would pass over the wires, or an explosion would sever them, and we'd lose the signal. Signallers worked to repair them, but until they were fixed, commanders would lose control over the fighting. Without radio communications, the heavy artillery, the tanks and our airplanes, primary support for our infantry, were blind and deaf. This issue persisted well into 1943 and even 1944, until the Americans equipped half our ground forces and our entire air force with radio communications. From day to day, we cadets underwent a second university of military training. During field exercises, officers paid particular attention to the practical skills necessary for handling the new equipment. We often conducted large-scale combined manoeuvres at the level of the regiment and even the division, involving tanks and artillery. We clambered onto the tanks and went into the attack with them. There were several alerts during this period, and battalions would be sent on foot to the threatened sector of the front. Once the emergency passed, we would return to our reserve positions. In the summertime, the nights were short, and we lay in our tents listening to the distant sounds of droning, explosions, and rumbles, the ongoing activity at the front lines. We knew we would soon join the fight. During short moments of rest, I liked to retreat into the forest, find a somewhat drier place, and turn to my memories. Although I logically understood I was now living by different standards, I couldn't let go of my past. Heavy rains began in early July, and fierce downpours turned the earth into a swamp, but our field exercises never stopped. We often walked soaked to the skin and exhausted, but we understood the importance of our training. A lost day of training could not be returned at the front. We spent entire days crawling on the ground, learning how to dig in quickly and deeply. We learned how to fire on the move, from the hip, build better machine gun nests, resist panic on the battlefield, and suppress enemy firing positions. We trained until exhaustion. At first, we cadets were confused. How did it happen that everything we had been taught in the specialist school was now useless in combat conditions? Some even said, If only we could send those instructors to battle, then let them teach us. Over time, our confusion faded, replaced by growing confidence. One officer's words stuck with me. Remember, fellows, risk should always be tempered by common sense. And that's exactly what they taught us. In less than 3 months, a new combat division was created in the forests around Tver, practically under the nose of the enemy. Despite many soldiers having no previous combat training, the division commander worked tirelessly to form a fully trained military unit, equipped and ready for battle. I only managed to see the division commander himself a few fleeting times, but on one occasion he spent an entire day with our battalion. He had a high forehead, hair combed back, and a young face. Though he was somewhere in his 40s, Kupriyanov looked 10 years younger. His gaze was friendly but focused, displaying his inner strength. He spoke with the soldiers, asking about our training, whether we knew our weapons, and if we could use the terrain effectively, both defensively and offensively. He addressed us as lads, and in the harsh year of 1942, that simple word had a calming effect on us. Kupriyanov took a particular interest in the cadets, asking us about our specialist school, our readiness for battle, and how we were being fed. One day he gathered the full battalion in a field for a discussion, analysing our condition and explaining the importance of training. He spoke calmly and without haste, repeating himself when necessary. His manner was more like a teacher than a military commander. In his conclusion, he said, "The day for the battalion review has been set. Get ready for it. Combat training is hard work, but it is also a necessary business. In battle, your life and our general success will depend upon our ability to fight." It is difficult to forget the day of the 30th of July 1942, when the battalion commander read us Order Number 227, issued by Stalin on the 28th of July 1942. This order, later known as the Not One Step Back order, froze everyone in place. It was a desperate proclamation. Further retreat means ruin for yourself and for your motherland. The gravity of these words was overwhelming. The order reintroduced penal companies for soldiers and penal battalions for officers, and for the first time since the Russian Civil War, extreme measures were announced to prevent retreat without orders. Some soldiers praised the order, while others cursed it. Some even cried, realizing the fate of their families in the path of the German advance. As one old soldier said, "We've lived out our time. The Germans have broken through to the Volga." The discussion was heated, but our company commander, Sukhomirov, reassured us, "Don't worry, guys. Nobody's going to send you to a penal company. But understand, extreme situations call for extreme measures." Regarding the men who ended up in punitive units, it is known that about 300,000 men served in these companies or battalions. These units played a crucial role in breaking through enemy defences, particularly on the Minsk axis. It was often these men who opened the way for tank armies, despite the fact that many fell in the furious fighting. The Germans, too, had similar punitive measures in place, including punitive companies and blocking detachments. Shortly before the division was to depart for the front, Kupriyanov unexpectedly visited the regiment to meet with all the cadets. As he looked over the soldiers, he asked, "Does it trouble you, lads, that you weren't given the chance to graduate from your specialist school?" One cadet replied, "It was upsetting, Comrade Division Commander, that everything turned out so awkwardly." Kupriyanov smiled and said, "Forget the insult, and don't torment yourselves over it. You now understand how badly you were needed at the front. We are obliged to carry out Comrade Stalin's order to drive the enemy from the Rzhev-Vyazima bridgehead and take Rzhev. Hitler considers this bridgehead a springboard for an attack on Moscow. Together, we will not let him succeed. I believe in you. You are the foundation of the division. Powerful weapons are in your hands. Our general success and the cost of that success depend upon how well you handle your weapons in battle. Once we begin to fight, I am confident that many of you will become commanders of platoons, companies, and perhaps even battalions. I will stress 3 points. First, you must suppress the enemy firing points. Secondly, I authorize you to take any initiative. If your commanding officer becomes disabled, don't wait for an order. Take command yourself. Finally, Cooperate with the tanks in battle, just as we taught you to do. I also want to say a word about bravery. In what does the bravery and perspicaciousness of an officer consist? In Lev Tolstoy's tale, The Raid, an officer judges that a brave man acts on the battlefield as it should be. Brave is he who fears that which he needs to fear, and not that which he needn't fear. Pay attention, lads, to this simple and very sensible advice. Are there any questions? Do we have enough combat supplies? We have enough. In 41 we had only about 10 shells per mortar. Today we have 10 times more. What about our equipment? We have powerful artillery of various calibers. We have many tanks. Among them there is one that is better than any the Germans have, the T-34. Protect them. Help the tank crews as much as you can, and they will protect you. Will we have air cover? Our pilots have given us their word. The Germans have more airplanes, but that state of affairs won't last long, as you will see. What about the medical services? They are ready. The division has a strong medical sanitation battalion. They have sent us highly qualified doctors and nurses. Assist the medics on the battlefield. Take care of your officers and comrades. Don't be afraid of a little blood. But I ask you to consider previous experience. In a few units during the July offensive, many soldiers abandoned the front lines and headed for the rear under the guise of giving aid to the wounded. Such a thing must not happen. How should we treat prisoners? Don't shoot them. Send them to the rear and they'll sort things out there. Will paths to the enemy's defences be cleared of mines? Certainly. For the infantry, we will clear paths 1.5 meters wide. For the tanks, 3 meters. I have a certain question, Comrade Division Commander. It is known that in the July offensive, some battalion commanders led their units with unfurled banners, like the Whites in the film Chapayev. What about us? I'm not familiar with such cases. I don't permit anyone to do such a stupid thing. Someone gathered up the courage to ask about blocking detachments. I assure you all, responded the division commander, that I have asked the army commander to spare this division from blocking detachments. What an unexpected meeting. Soon they knew about it in all the division's units. Leaping ahead, I will say that the division commander kept his word. The company commander, Senior Lieutenant Sukhomirov. On the 22nd of August, all training was cancelled. The Soldiers' Telegraph reported that the division commander was going to review all the regiments before our departure for the front lines. The review lasted a full day. In the evening, Senior Lieutenant Sukhomirov called the company together. In one of the cosy little forest clearings under a setting sun, the entire company gathered. 129 soldiers and sergeants and 7 officers, the company commander Sukhomirov, the company's commissar, 3 platoon commanders, the sergeant major, and the company medic. Sukhomirov spoke with the soldiers calmly, as if nothing particular was happening, but each of us sensed that his words were important and not easy for him to articulate. "My golden fellows," began our commander, "the day after tomorrow, our 215th Rifle Division will go on the attack. For many of us, this will be our first battle. You are immortal. The first battle for a soldier is the most difficult, his baptism of fire. From it begins and by it will be confirmed our sacred soldier's duty to defend the motherland. The enemy is strong, but you have also, in a short amount of time, become more experienced, better prepared to engage the enemy. Remember, if you don't kill the German, he will kill you. Here there can be no hesitations. On the attack, don't panic. Strive to keep up your courage. There is nothing more frightening than fear itself. Don't surrender to it. Only a mouse is afraid of everything. We didn't come here to die. We've come to liberate our native land. I will lead you in battle. I will be with you. Those you know well, with whom you have already experienced so much, will be by your side. We will all be in this together." The soldiers listened to their commander, scarcely breathing, and caught his every word, as if it might become their armour and shield in the impending battle. When he stopped talking, silence reigned. The first to rise and speak was Mikhail, an old soldier from the 2nd platoon. Everyone respected him for his honesty, sincerity, and for striving to defend his right to observe his religious faith. Mikhail had often behaved oddly, but on this occasion he made such a strange impression that the entire company groaned. "Comrade Senior Lieutenant, thank you for your kind, fatherly parting words. We won't let you down. If I live, I won't ever forget such good words. But there is one thing you said, forgive me, with which I must disagree. You, Comrade Senior Lieutenant, called us immortal. Forgive me again, but we all know only God alone is immortal, while we, simple people, are all mortal. But it doesn't follow that we should fear death. A man's entire life, however it turns out to be, short or long, is just preparation for our meeting with the Supreme Being. Isn't that so?" Sukhomirov only smiled. "There is an old saying, 'He who fears death is already no longer living.' Isn't that so, Mikhail?" Sukhomirov then asked if there were any more questions. A soldier asked, "Comrade Senior Lieutenant, and how can we fight a little better and still remain alive?" The commissar answered, "There isn't any reasoning during battle. In battle, all thoughts are focused on one thing, the destruction of the foe. Drive him back, kill him, that's how you'll remain alive." In reality, the primitive and pithy advice raised some doubts. Everyone talked like the company commander. How many times had we heard, "Kill the German," but just try to get at the enemy to kill him. The night before our departure for the front, the officers left, and everyone kept silent, falling into deep thought. For almost 100 days, from the end of May, the division had been located in the Army's reserve. We had been preparing and waiting for this moment, some with impatience, some with showy patriotism, some with dread. And now the time had come. Why have we all become so sad, invisible, and quiet, like pebbles on the bottom of a river? A loud, deliberately cheerful voice inquired, trying to rouse everyone. Nobody responded. Men were smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and speaking softly, as if trying to preserve their voices. The time was coming when one could shout oneself hoarse. As always happens in psychologically complex situations, everyone behaved in their own way. Optimists chatted about all sorts of nonsense, joked, chuckled, and recalled cheerful stories. Others held their tongues, occasionally heaving deep, sad sighs. Many tried to display greater attention to each other, even in the pettiest matters. They say, "If you want to cheer yourself up, cheer up your comrade." Perhaps intuitively following this adage, that's how we were behaving. We exchanged addresses. "If something happens, write my family." "How could that be? Your father is in prison, and yet you get into the Komsomol." Shurka was indignant. At my interview with the Komsomol District Committee, they asked, "Is your father an enemy of the people?" I answered, "The investigation has still not been completed." They didn't seem to want to accept me and conferred for a long time, but in the end they took me in. Perhaps, therefore, I was joining out of pure spite, or perhaps simply like everyone else. You always hear Komsomol members saying, "like everyone else." That's rubbish! They tricked me even more cruelly than you. Damn them all! All right, they purged some souls. Now let's talk frankly about tomorrow. What are we fighting for? For the miscreants who killed my father and almost did yours in? For that pioneer's red tie of Pavlik Morozov, a darling of Stalinist propaganda who informed on his own father? Or for all your Komsomol members? Really, why had I joined the Komsomol? It is amusing that it was only then, on the eve of battle, that I gave serious thought to the matter. What career advantages could we be thinking about at that age? The Komsomol membership card couldn't save anyone from his fate. So many people who carried party identification cards were executed during the purges. Did I join out of a sense of idealism? What sort of ideals can someone have at that age? But then, why did I join? Moreover, party members and Komsomol members were supposed to be in the front ranks of any attack, in order to give their lives in the name of what? But I didn't share these thoughts with Shurka. Instead, I answered him, "Nevertheless, Shurka, you and I have sworn an oath to defend the motherland." "I'm curious, what sort of motherland are you planning to defend? The one that betrayed our fathers and mothers? For me, it will be the most exquisite, magnificent day when I can strike dead just one commissar or Chekist osobist, a secret agent of the Special Department. They're just dogs that aren't even fit for damnation. No, kind sir, I'm going into battle for different reasons. I'll be fighting against the foreigners who have laid their hands on Russian soil and who rape our women and girls. My Cossack grandfather and Cossack father were always a source of support for the fatherland and the Tsar, so for the fatherland I'll never be afraid to lay down my life. But you must never compare yourself to us. You must live on. You are not a Russian, but I know our Russian fatherland is as dear to you as it is to me. I'll never forget those animated and painfully sincere words, and those feelings I experienced at that moment when we were all on death's door. The platoon couldn't sleep. "It's going to be quite a show, guys. The High Command has grabbed us for a reason," someone said in the darkness. "Yes, it appears that our turn has come. We've spent such a long time in the rear. But now, likely, they'll be giving us 300 more grams of bread." "And how much does a German bullet weigh, do you know? Oh, old friend, is a supplement like that lying in wait for us? I don't know who's right here, but tomorrow I imagine everything will be different. Why are you chattering like magpies after hearing about that menacing document? Now they really have us in a bind. In front of us, the German, behind us, the blocking detachment. You advance, you'll get a German bullet, but if you fall back, your own guys will knock you off. If you're condemned to die, then let it be worth something," a young voice rang out. "What's the use of that, old friend?" another voice responded. "If only we can topple the German." How different we all were. I dozed off a little, and, it had to be, I had a short dream. I'm 7 years old. I'm walking up to a watchdog. The dog, rising on its rear paws, licks me. He's waiting for something. Perhaps I've brought him a little treat. But how can I explain it to him? Mamma didn't let me take even the smallest piece of bread. Whatever people think, it is shameful to feed a dog bread. I woke up and remembered the end of this story. The dog was lying quietly, warming himself in the sun. I walked up to him, and when he rose to his feet, I sat down on his back. What was I thinking? The dog became genuinely infuriated, abruptly tossed the uninvited rider off his back, then gave me a strong bite on the leg and ran off. Howling in pain, I rushed home. The wound required 32 stitches to close. The dog turned out not to be rabid, just proud, and perhaps the dog considered me to be a miser? A week later, a black van from the city dog pound pulled up, and 3 dog catchers grabbed the dog, dragged it forcibly back to the van, threw it inside, and then drove off. Later, the kids found out that the dog had been put to sleep. How I cried! Nobody could comfort me. Before this night, I had never before remembered a dream, and I never believed in them whenever someone would try to tell me about one. I, of course, didn't know anything about Freud and Jung, though I recall one day buying a thin little booklet at a market for a few kopecks, entitled The Dream Book, published in St. Petersburg in 1912. I was curious, so I read it and broke out laughing. It turned out that any sort of dream, and the author introduced approximately 100 subjects, supposedly reflects some sort of real event in your past or future life. Since I didn't have dreams, I couldn't check the accuracy of the author's words. But now, on the eve of battle, I had just had the first dream in my life that I could recall. I was curious. Did it portend something about the morrow? Shirka was now snoring, but my neighbour on the other side was whispering to someone, so I asked, "With whom are you whispering?" I was nonplussed by the response. "With God," he quietly answered. "I'm waiting for a miracle from him, so I'm praying for one thing, to give me a good omen." "Do you think he'll hear you?" "Oh, yes, he's heard. He sent me a pretty bug. That, friend, is a good omen. Memories of my grandfather flooded my mind. Soon after my father's arrest, fearing for my fate, Mamma sent me from Kharkov to my grandfather in Kiev, where he lived with his daughter, my father's sister. Grandfather once spent an entire night sitting on the balcony, praying to God, asking him for a positive sign about his son, my father. and he received it. The first thing my father did when he was released from prison was to go to Kiev. By that time my grandfather was seriously ill. He had wasted away, worrying about the fate of his son. In 1940, just before his death, he asked me, whatever the life path I chose, not to go into the police, not to engage in commerce, and not to become a fireman. I gave him my word, and I kept my word. For all of us, these final hours before heading to the front became special. But none of us could imagine that our commanding officer spent the whole night writing letters to our mothers. I don't know how many letters he managed to write, and whether or not every mother received one. My mamma did receive his warm words about her son, and she preserved this letter as something sacred to the end of her life. Yes, you don't often come across such a company commander. A better one, perhaps, I never knew. It is worthwhile here to mention another little episode. One evening a soldier fell asleep at his post. Another soldier, a sly fellow, took the sleeping soldier's rifle and brought it back to our company commander. "Look, comrade senior lieutenant, how vigilant I am." But instead of gratitude he heard, "I hope next time you'll behave differently. Take the post in place of your comrade while he sleeps from exhaustion." Then Sukhomirov added, "I hope you know the name of Suvorov. Once Suvorov told someone about a similar case. I advise you to learn to forgive the sins of your neighbour, but not to forgive your own. Learn to forgive, soldier, and don't tell tales." This episode, and soon the entire company knew about it, says everything about our company commander. We didn't know much about him. Ostensibly he was a Siberian. He graduated from the Omsk Combat Infantry Specialist School. He fought in the battle for Moscow. He got into trouble somewhere once, and the army bureaucrats locked him in a death grip. Our combat commander never advanced in rank or assignment. Twice wounded, he never received a single decoration. Sukhomirov ate from the same kettle we did. If the cook prepared a poor meal for us, the company commander didn't hide his displeasure. He would roundly rebuke both the cook and the sergeant major. Before we left for the front, he summoned both men, ordering them to remain in the rear and prepare the tastiest meal for everyone who might return from the battle. He told them not to spare any supplies, so that everyone could have seconds. A bullet cut him down in the opening minutes of the attack. He was a splendid, courageous man, the very embodiment of the true soldier. That's how I'll always remember him. Up ahead, on a low rise, the outlines of the German trenches were barely visible. They were girding in a semicircle 3 villages, which we had been ordered to take at any cost. Before the battle, our commanders had explained to us, with the capture of these villages, a key strong point in the German defences would be eliminated, and this would open a direct road to Rzhev for the 30th Army. Before us lay a green field with brown patches, small copses of trees and wooded hollows, all of it blasted and ploughed up repeatedly far and wide by shells and craters. To the villages, or more accurately, to what was left of them, it was about 700, 800 metres, no more. It seemed like we could reach them without batting an eye. A soft morning breeze caressed our faces, and the first rays of the morning sun appeared in a clear, clean sky. The stench of corpses, carried to our trenches with the wind, spoiled the scene and the mood of the men. Somewhere nearby, the bodies of those who had fallen in previous fighting had been dumped. Why hadn't they been buried? At first our heads lightly spun from the repulsive odour, and we felt nauseous, but gradually we got used to it. To our rear, one after the other, we could hear bomb blasts. Junkers? Apparently they were trying to suppress the reserves who were moving up to the front lines. How many times had we been warned about concealment? The bombing stopped. Again it was silent. The enemy still remained quiet. It wouldn't be easy to deal with him, but we had tanks, and not only that, we had 34S, the best tanks in the world. Moreover, our artillery and Katyusha rockets would smash all their defences into pieces, even before we attacked, and our airplanes would give us support. The Germans wouldn't be able to withstand it, so our commanders told us. It was quiet. We only heard single shots ringing out from our lines or their lines now and then. Everything was deceptively innocent and peaceful, as if a truce had been called. It led one to think, Why must people kill one another? There is before battle an hour of great quiet, sometimes not an hour, but a minute. Nowhere else is there such silence, as happens in war, Konstantin Simonov accurately wrote. Only a few calculated minutes remained. Melancholy thoughts of my mother didn't leave me. Suddenly, a silly rhyme flooded my thoughts. A man swept off his feet from Bassein Street. I had my rifle in my hands, and I felt calm. I wasn't alone. I had the motionless soldiers of my squad beside me, also holding their breaths. They were here, with me, ready to come to my assistance. I looked for signs of movement among the Germans and waited for the command. The glow of sunrise on the horizon burned even brighter, which slightly darkened the azure blue of the sky, just like at sunset. Was time running backward? No, that couldn't be. Attack! The first salvos of artillery shattered the calm air. That meant it was 6 a.m., the preparatory artillery barrage. Volleys of Katyusha rockets shrieked high overhead as they flew toward the enemy. The roaring and crashing grew. Our bombers and ground attack planes had started working over the enemy's trenches. Wonderful. Everything was going just as it should. Everything was according to plan. Above the villages, which we were just about to try to take, enormous columns of black smoke and crimson flames rose into the air. What a pleasant scene! Our tanks emerged from the woods behind us, carrying infantry on their hulls. I gave them a quick count, no fewer than 30. In 2 lines, they skirted the line of trenches and moved resolutely forward. Such power, that's the way. The company commander gave the signal to get ready, and suddenly I felt as if I were all alone, the only person on earth. A green signal rocket raced high into the air. The voice of our commander pierced my brain. "After me! Forward! Charge!" Oh, how difficult it was to tear myself from the ground. It seemed as if I were sprawled, rooted into the soil, with no arms or legs and no ability to move. Didn't I have my arms? The trench is your last reliable fortress. The final seconds. Forget about everything else, soldier. The order had sounded. Get up, friend. Let's go. Time strangely slowed down and moved in fits and starts. At the last moment, I managed to catch sight of the bright sky and the earth's wonderful field before me, and, clenching my teeth, now no longer thinking of anything, as if I had switched off my mind, I rose up slightly in my burrow. The inexorable power of the call of duty instantly forced me out of my trench, shoved me forward, and now I was running. Together with everyone else, tipping my helmet-covered head forward, just as we were taught to do, bending low, my rifle with its attached bayonet thrust aggressively forward. I hurried quickly, trying not to lag behind those running beside me, and like everyone, I was crazily yelling, although I felt a cold trickle of sweat on my forehead under my helmet. But I strained my lungs and shouted, "Ura-ah! Ura-ah!" And this unifying cry brought with it some new mysterious strength, muffled my hearing and stifled my fear. We were attacking head-on, in echelons, and my company was advancing in the second line. Other men were hurrying in front of us and behind us. Whoever was lucky tried to follow the tanks. They covered all the same, but they were in front of us, as we still hadn't caught up with the tanks. Forward, about 300 metres to the heights remained. We'd already overcome half the distance. And at that moment, the German trenches spoke up. A growing destructive fire swept up and down the attacking lines with a storm of machine gun fire. The hoarse coughing of mortars followed the machine guns. Artillery started to roar. Enormous geysers of earth tossed the living and the dead high into the air. Thousands of shell splinters, like poisonous hornets, ripped into men, tearing bodies and the earth. How could this be? It appeared that our artillerymen didn't reconnoitre the enemy's firing positions. Did they just pound vacant space for 30 minutes? Never mind. The tanks were moving forward with infantry on board. Having successfully navigated the minefields, they were now approaching the enemy's front line, moving with all their mass and firing on enemy positions. They'd fix everything. They were just about to reach the German trenches, where our infantry would toss their hand grenades, while the tanks crushed the German positions. Suddenly, Stuka dive bombers appeared above the battlefield from the direction of Rzhev. Confidently and impudently, they headed straight for the tanks. One tank, a second. A third exploded from the direct attacks, turning into large black and crimson bonfires. But the remaining tanks, quickly dispersing, continued to advance on their objective. The bombers were flying in flights. The lead plane, turning on its siren, gracefully went into a dive and, having released its bomb on its target, soared skyward again. After it, in single file, dived a second, a third, a fourth, a 10th, forming a unique carousel above the hastily scattering tanks. The bloody feast of the vultures, occurring in eyesight of the charging soldiers, caused a commotion. Where were our fighters? Why hadn't they arrived to protect the tanks and infantry? One group of the birds of prey, having dropped its bombs, flew away, but another took its place, and the whole grim process repeated. Having arranged a merciless funeral procession, they didn't let their victims escape the fatal pocket. From that terrible day, I could never bear the wild animal howling of German Stukas. The wailing they emitted was head-splitting. It froze your soul, cast you into confusion, paralyzed you like the gaze of a venomous cobra, and lingered in your ears for a long, long time. Even after the war, I never once dared to visit a zoo, because I feared the wail or howl of an animal there might bring me to nervous collapse. Nonetheless, the German bombers could not deal completely with our tanks, and weren't able to destroy them all. The infantry also, despite the dense curtains of machine gun fire from the front and the flanks, continued the attack, and our first ranks were approaching the first line of the enemy's trenches. However, they weren't able to reach it in the first rush, and our fighters, lying behind shrubs and little mounds, hiding in little hollows and gullies, opened fire on the enemy's firing points from under cover, while the following ranks continued to advance. A rising rumble and the din of powerful explosions suddenly tore the air. It was the enemy's heavy long-range artillery trying to separate the infantry from the tanks. Huge gaps appeared in the first lines of infantry following the tanks. The air was sucked from our lungs, and it became harder and harder to breathe. My throat was parched, and I was tormented by thirst. I was suffocating from nausea. Where was the sky? Where was the earth? We no longer understood, nor could we feel. Our hearts pounded as if they were about to burst from our bodies, and hatred rose in a furious wave for those who were so pitilessly destroying us. "Forward! Forward!" shouted the officers who were still alive, many just before dropping dead among their own soldiers. The men were mechanically moving forward, and many were dying, but we now no longer belonged to ourselves. We had all been seized by the incomprehensibly savage element of battle. Shell bursts, shell fragments, and bullets were sweeping away the infantry lines, shredding the living and the dead. How could people withstand such a thing? Where could one protect oneself in such a hell? The ranks of the attackers were thinning, but even more new units were filling in the gaps. The remnants of former companies and battalions had turned into a senseless mass of onward-charging, desperate men. The din of battle swallowed the cries of the wounded. Medics, risking their own lives, rushed about, caught between the wall of heavy fire and these terrible cries. Trying to help those they could, the medics dragged the maimed and bleeding to the nearest shell craters. In the howl and shriek of shells, we stopped recognizing one another. Faces had become pale, lips compressed. Many men were trembling from fear. Some men were vomiting. Some were crying as they advanced, and the tears, mixed with sweat and filth, streamed down their faces and blinded their eyes. Some men had involuntarily urinated or defecated from the shock. Wild swearing and cursing filled the air. One man was trying to cross himself on the run, gazing upwards with a prayer. Someone was calling for his beloved Marusaka. Suddenly I jerked to a stop. A wounded man grabbed me, pulling me downward, and shouted directly in my face, "It's me, Zhenia! We're from the same barracks! Yes, of course, it was Zhenka, our Zhenechka!" His gaze was feverish, and in his eyes was the black shadow of approaching death. Shaken, I nodded my head, and babbled something in a whisper. Yes, Zhenechka, yes. Heavily straining, he was wheezing in a heart-rending fashion, straining to say something more, but I could barely hear the words. "I don't have much time. Do you understand? Understand? Find my mama, I beg you." Our company favourite could say nothing more, as blood gushed from his throat and poured down his chest in a wide current. He turned over and fell prostrate to the earth. Everything was over. For a moment I forgot where I was. Noise crashed in my ears. I could see Janechka's pale face in front of me. It was transformed again. It had become handsome and illuminated, just as before. Frantic cries resounded all around me, from which it was possible to go insane. I got up and started running to catch up with my comrades. Across the battlefield, ceaseless wailing and howling rose above the infernal carnage. "The damned scoundrels! Where's my foot? Medic! Medic! Pilots, save us! What have you done with us? You're driving us into machine guns like cattle!" Again this hoarse voice. "Maruska, where are you?" Attacking waves of men followed one after another. The conflict flared up. The piles of corpses grew. We drew even nearer to the enemy trenches. This was the most difficult moment of battle. The night before, our sappers had cleared passageways through the minefields, and now remnants of the attackers were rushing through them. I saw the first soldiers as they reached the trenches, broke into them. Now frenzied hand-to-hand fighting with bayonets and fists ensued. But I was not able to run up to join it. The last thing that I heard was some sort of senseless cry. With this cry, I felt, painfully and sharply, something cold, slippery and blunt strike me in the back of the neck, stunning me and slamming my head forward against my chest. The strong jolt rocked me sharply, threw me forward, and I crashed face first to the ground. But I never lost consciousness. I could feel that I was suffocating, that my nose and mouth were filled with earth and dirty grass. I spat it out, and it became easier to breathe. Lifting my head with difficulty, I saw fighters, who were running past a large crater. I had to reach it. I crawled over and slid down into it. For several minutes I understood nothing from the shock of my wound, and didn't notice anything around me. At first the Germans were shaken and fell back, but then they pulled themselves together and went on the counter-attack. Bloody fighting erupted for every metre of progress and every building. All the same, the warriors of the 711th and 707th Regiments, as well as the 2nd Guards Division, managed to seize several city districts where street fighting developed with shifting success. Days of street fighting stretched on, one day just like the next. Either we would seize a building and all the advantageous approaches to it, or the Germans would. At times it wasn't clear where our guys were and where the Germans were. At the height of the fighting, when the Germans, having received reinforcements, launched a counter-offensive with tank support, a terrible misfortune occurred. On the 2nd of October 1942, my comrade and the favourite of our group of cadets, Lance Corporal Stepan Yakovlevich Davidov, a machine gunner in the 711th Rifle Regiment of the 215th Rifle Division, was killed in action. 2 days later, when the situation had become somewhat stabilized, we found Stepan's body by his machine gun. Stepan considered that a real soldier is distinguished by two necessary characteristics: the ability to fight and the ability to protect his comrade. Stepan demonstrated both by his own personal example. Only he couldn't manage to save himself. On the day I was wounded, while trying to get off the battlefield, I reached the road, where I saw a throng of wounded men dragging themselves along. Staggering, I started to drag myself after them. Trucks loaded with the badly wounded were passing us, often stopping to pick up those who could no longer move under their own power. At last, we saw the first aid tents ahead of us. There were many of them. I immediately became concerned. We were about 5 kilometres from the front line, far too close for comfort. Just one shell from a heavy long-range gun, and nothing would remain of these tents. As if to confirm my fears, I heard a strong explosion nearby. A blast wave shook the nearby woods like the winds of a squall line, and I heard an ominous sound, the crack of falling trees. I moved a little closer to one tent, next to which a nurse was standing. "Why is the Medsunbat so close to the front?" I inquired. The nurse smiled at my alarm. Don't worry, soldier. During battles, we always deploy the medical stations as close as possible to the front. For the wounded, especially the severely wounded, even an extra minute, or an extra hour or day, can be critical to his survival. I staggered over to the woods. I felt a bit disoriented. It was not easy to step into this different world, where a trampled soul could free itself a little from the terrible sights and sounds of battle. Here, hope lived in the magical hands of the doctor, who might bring you back from the edge of death. The doctor's habitat was a genuine little city in the forest, with broad clearings, expansive green glades, and beautiful little roads and paths. It felt like stumbling upon a peaceful, quiet little island, a kingdom of tranquility and harmony amidst the whirlwind of bullets and shell fire raging around you. A post with plywood signs, situated at the entrance to the little city, served as the basic reference point for all those who arrived on foot or by horse-drawn cart. In a large, double-sized tent immediately opposite this signpost, a triage station was located. I took a seat on a little stump, took a breath, and looked around. In the clearing, wounded men were sitting or lying on the grass. A nurse was taking down the names of those who had just arrived, while a doctor would walk up to them, have a conversation with each, give them a quick examination, and often send someone directly to the surgeon's tent out of turn. Then he would move on, stopping at each patient to assess their fate. From one of the tents, a male medical orderly stepped out to have a smoke, and he took a seat beside me. Seeing my downcast look, he didn't ask any questions, but spoke up himself. "You, soldier, don't worry. Although I'm not a doctor, I can see that you'll soon return to your comrades. Of course, we nurses are medical personnel, but we're also soldiers, just like you, and we have combat experience. Whenever there's an offensive, up to 700, 800 men come to us for treatment. Anything can happen even here. Sometimes a blast wave topples the operating tables with the wounded on them, and the instruments, bandages, and dishes. Well, there's no point in even looking for them. By some miracle, a man has been plucked alive from the battlefield and brought here, but here he receives new wounds. Several times after such attacks, we've been forced to start all over again. Such a thing has happened. Once an entire tent, and all the people inside it, were blown higher than the trees. Another time, a shell fragment passed through an operating tent and took off the head of a doctor. That's just what happened. A reliable fellow told me the same thing happened to a nurse once, so shells reach us too. Once, a random round struck an ambulance, which had just arrived bringing wounded to the hospital. A real incident, brother. Recently, 2 of our dear female nurses were killed. We were safely situated, it seemed, in a deep ravine. There was a little village not far away, and so they decided to let the female nurses go there to get a little sleep. Just then, an air raid occurred, a direct attack. One vile bomb fell directly on the hut where the nurses were sleeping. Anything can happen here with us. But generally speaking, they didn't keep the wounded here long. If they were lightly wounded, they treated the wound and sent them right back to their units. If they were hit a little more badly, they sent them for a week or 2 to the convalescent battalion, and then back to the front dot. Just then, a doctor and a female nurse stepped out of the tent. The medical orderly joined them, and the 3 of them quickly headed into the depths of the woods. Yes, there's a hospital for you. 2 nurses replaced the orderly, and from them I learned that the doctors were cursing the flow of men who had shot themselves in the foot or hand, especially non-Slavs from the southern republics, and men who were feigning injury. The men who shot themselves were quite creative in their efforts to erase the signs of their crime. They shot themselves through a loaf of bread, a rag, or a tin can. They asked other soldiers to help them, or they would raise their left hand above the trench, and a German sniper would help them out. Fakers also annoyed the doctors. A fellow would arrive, holding his stomach and groaning. But often such a patient would quietly walk away. Having seen the work of the doctors, and seeing that it was not so easy to deceive them, many men would confess, and a tribunal would follow. I was called for treatment just before evening. After hearing my story, the doctor cut the clothes away from my wound, carefully examined it, gave it a feel, and then, in a way that I cannot remember, immediately extracted something from my neck. I could feel the wound start bleeding again, but the doctor and nurse quickly staunched the flow. A metal fragment, most likely from a German shell, the doctor said. It was stuck in the soft tissue of your neck. You were lucky, just as lucky, I'd say, as if you had won the lottery. Now hold still, rascal. He cleaned the wound, trimmed away some dead skin, and applied iodine. Then he sewed up my neck, and we were done. He laid a piece of metal on my palm, about the size of a Tsar's 5-kopeck coin,